It's been the week, really, when lots of people who are pro-staying in the EU, and I suppose the Prime Minister has made his most pro-EU comments for a long time when he was speaking in Norway about Iceland, about Norway, beg your pardon. It's been the week when we've been looking, therefore, at the options for Britain outside the European Union. Can I raise, first of all, what the Prime Minister was saying? He said, look, Norway spends more per head on the EU than we do, and more people migrate into Norway proportionally than come here, and therefore life outside is not quite so sunny.
Well, the fact we're discussing this shows you that the renegotiation isn't going anywhere. So rather than us attacking him for his lack of demands, he's trying to move the debate on, actually, in a sense, to the end game. I mean, look, I find it very odd in one way that we're told by British politicians that we're not big enough to survive on our own in the world. And when you see examples of little countries that are surviving on their own, in fact, are much richer than we are, we hear the Prime Minister being disparaging about them, which I find odd. Norway sells 75% of its overseas goods to the European marketplace. It trades with the European marketplace at a premium. It has opted to be a member of the European Economic Area, which is, in a sense, an anti-room for European Union, which means free movement of people, and which means they do pay some money, although most of it actually voluntarily.
So we wouldn't want their model.
But those arrangements suit Norway. We are a country of 65 million people. We are now the biggest trading market in the world for the Eurozone. They sell us £50 billion worth of goods every year, more than we sell them. If Norway, Iceland and Switzerland can get deals that suit them, we can do something far, far better than that.
Nonetheless, a lot of people who might say, I'd quite like to get out of the EU, we could control our borders again, our parliament can be properly sovereign again, are worried about the economic consequences of this. Well, and they're worried partly because they haven't yet heard from people like you a detailed account of the kind of relationship of a post-EU Britain with the EU. What would it feel like? What kind of, what would we be negotiating?
What we'd be doing is getting out of political union with Europe and rejoining the world. You know, at the moment, it's incredible, really. We're the fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world, depending what measure you use, and we're actually banned from making our own trade deals with any other part of the world. I want us to have a simple free trade agreement with the European Union, not to be a member of a political club, not to be subject to the decision of its courts, and to be free. And to be fair,
would you want access to the single market?
I would want access to the single market, just as China does and every other country in the world does, but I don't want to be a member of the single market, and here's why. Only 15% of the British economy is exporting goods to the European Union, yet the regulations of that market affect 100% of the British economy. Now, I think, freed from political union, we'll go on buying, selling goods with each other, that's fine, but we'll be free to make our own trade deals and to look at the mass of European law which falls on our small and medium-sized businesses, and to say, do you know what, with a bit of lightening up, actually, economically, we'd be far better off outside it than in.
And yet countries like Norway and Switzerland, you mentioned as well, have to pay a pretty hefty price into EU coffers for the privilege of being able to trade there.
Actually, Norway voluntarily pays most of this money, and it doesn't go to Brussels. It goes directly to the newer accession countries, so that is a completely different arrangement. And frankly, Cameron put that pretty falsely to people the other day. But then again, I suppose in one way...
What about Switzerland?
In one way, Norway can afford to give people money. It's rich. It's
got
successful. Well, it's got fish.
It's got fish and
look
oil.
at Scotland. Look at the east coast of England. We've given away, well, a tremendous resource worth billions of pounds every year. Norway chooses its own deal. We will choose our own deal. We're in a much stronger negotiating position than Norway ever has been.
Now, you said earlier on that we could then trade with the rest of the world, but Michael Froment, the US trade representative, was very, very clear this week. He said, we're not interested in a free trade agreement with a separate country. We do a free trade deal with the EU. And if Britain left the EU, we would not have a free trade deal with Britain. And therefore, British goods would be paying a tariff going into the
He's clearly been paid to say that, hasn't he? I mean, this is the big political club gathering around the Prime Minister, who clearly is in desperate trouble with this referendum. Look, this is laughable. You know, America's got a free trade deal with Oman. America's got a free trade deal with Australia. Are you seriously telling me that their oldest and closest global ally, with whom they do enormous amounts of business, and with whom and with whom big commercial companies would say, don't talk such nonsense.
Well, he says...
it's an attempt to scaremonger by a paid official, and I don't take it seriously.
It sounds quite scary to me. I mean, what he says is, I think it's absolutely clear that Britain has a greater voice at the trade table, being part of the EU, being part of a larger economic entity. We are not particularly in the market for FTAs with individual countries. We're building platforms that other countries can join. We have no FTA with the UK, so they would be subject to the same tariffs and other trade-related measures as China, Brazil or India.
Well, it's early in the morning, so I won't tell you what I really think about what he said.
Go on.
Look, Britain has more influence in the world as part of the EU in terms of trade. We don't even have a seat at the World Trade Organization. We've been asked before to leave the room. El Salvador's in the room, they've got a voice, and Britain hasn't. We will have far more influence globally on trade by being an independent country with our own seat at the WTO, but more important than that, with the ability to make bilateral trade deals. Switzerland has more free trade deals globally than we do, and she's negotiated it for herself.
So who's paying him to say this kind of stuff, Nigel?
Oh, the State Department or so. I mean, look,
you think this is the big guys ganging up on the anti-EU
It's the big guys
campaign?
politically ganging up. But what is interesting is that in the commercial world, this is not happening. That actually the big bosses, like from Nissan, are saying we will go on making cars in Sunderland, regardless whether we're in political union or not.
Standard & Poor's say that if we left, we'd lose our AAA rating and they might downgrade.
Is this the same Standard & Poor's that didn't tell us about the 2008 crash, that misread the biggest economic collapse of modern times? Sorry, I don't think their credibility is very high at the moment.
I guess the bigger point is that all these big economic voices, or many of these big economic voices, are, as it were, all now speaking from the same hymn book. And we know from the Scottish referendum, these, what you might call Project Fear, they called it up there, does have an effect.
These are political voices. You know, what you're hearing from the trade envoy is a political voice, not an economic voice. What we're hearing economically from big global trading companies is Britain will continue to trade, buy and sell goods and services back and forth between Britain and Europe, regardless whether we're members of a political union or not. But, and here's our key point, freed from that, we have bigger, better global opportunities.
Standard & Poor's also said that it would be worse for us because Scotland would leave. If the UK voted to leave, Scotland would then vote to leave the UK. Do you think that's a serious threat?
So they've gone from economic forecasters who got the 2008 collapse wrong now to political forecasters. I think we should ignore them on that too.
All right. Let's move to another big story of the week, which was the projected eye-watering rises in the UK population, another 10 million people in a generation. What effect would that have on Britain?
Well, I've been saying this now for a decade, that actually a population rising as rapidly as it is quite impossible for our primary school system to cope with, impossible for our health services to cope with. I mean, we already have to build a new house every 7 minutes in this country just to cope with current migration levels. And it's interesting that Theresa May's on today because she's picked up this theme very strongly. It has led to a lack of cohesion and division within our societies. You know, some will argue that if 10 million more people come, our GDP will rise. Well, actually, some things are more important than money, and the shape and cohesion and happiness of this country matters far more. If another 10 million people increase population in Britain in the next 25 years, our quality of life will go down.
And is there any way, in your view, any way at all that we can retain control of the number of people coming in while we're inside the EU?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely. There is no way we can do that. You know, we may get a deal on migrant benefits. What we will not get is a deal on an open door. And don't forget, just 2 weeks ago, the EU have decided, quite surprisingly, to speed up the accession deal with Turkey. That means another 75 million poor people will have total free rights to move to Britain or elsewhere.
You talk very eloquently on all of this. You'll have seen from one newspaper earlier in the week that Theresa May is the popular choice to lead this campaign. She's the person, it's said, who could bring over dissident Tories, UKIP, undecideds and so forth, very popular in the country. How do you react to that?
Well, I don't think she can't bring UKIP over because the figures on that were pretty overwhelming. Look, I've been campaigning on this for years. I was very pleased that poll said that I could bring people into this campaign from the Labour Party, from undecideds, Conservatives, etc. The point about Theresa May is this. She's the longest-serving Home Secretary of modern times. She has presided over the most disastrous immigration figures. If that person was to say, look, I've been here, I've been at the sharp end, we cannot do this as EU members, we need a better way, of course the public would come behind it. And you know what? So would I too.